Happy New Year for victims and villains. My name is Josh, and today we are traveling to South Korea to talk about the recent release of Blu-ray, DVD, and VOD. This is The Ghost Station. Based on a webcomic of the same name, The Ghost Station tells the story of an investigative journalist who basically starts investigating these weird murders that have happened at a local train station and uncovers a terrible plot that ends up being really heartbreaking. I really have to say that right out the gate, I had a really love-hate relationship for this movie. There are things that I think this movie does really well, including a really riveting mythology and heartbreaking lore about it. But I think having that paired with some really just not necessarily unlikable characters, but more uninteresting characters really started to hinder this one. Like, it's found out that our protagonist, this journalist that we follow, is really writing for a celebrity gossip, and yet you're led to believe that she writes for this really hard-hitting journalist, and it's just really weird choices like that in terms of narrative. I will say, though, that that angle allows for a really satisfying conclusion and ending on this one. But this movie just kind of feels like it has so much opportunity. This movie, as a horror movie, is just okay. With this being a ghost story, there are a lot of opportunities where you're going to see a lot of those jump scares that are kind of expected, that kind of almost feel synonymous with the genre now. And the jump scares that are positioned within the Ghost Station just kind of feel really cheap. I will say, on the plus side, though, the practical effects that make the jump scares possible look really good. This movie feels somewhat uneven from how the story structure is set up. First act definitely feels like it is the heaviest of the three that is leaning into the horror aspect, whereas there's kind of like a mystery whodunit element of the second act, and the third act attempts to bridge the gap between those two worlds, but it ultimately kind of fails and actually ends up being really messy. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like they pivot into the second act and automatically the characters are investigative journalists. It's a whodunit, it's a mystery. It definitely still retains some of those horror elements, but they are just very scarce in the second act and very sloppy in the third act. This film definitely feels out of time. And what I mean by that is, when you look at a film like, take Venom, for example, Venom definitely feels like it doesn't fit into the current wave of comic book movies that we're getting. And this definitely feels like it is from an era of kind of paranormal, supernatural horror that we were getting at the turn of the century. Geographically speaking, the movies that I'm going to compare this movie to are going to be movies like Ringu and Ju-on that come out of Japan and kind of pioneered the J-horror movement of the early 2000s. And this kind of feels like a distant cousin of those movies, but it also at the same time kind of feels like South Korea was kind of waiting to kind of have their own version of those stories being told, and that's kind of what this feels like. From a visual standpoint, there are different markings that make this film feel out of time. Some of the cinematography definitely has that grungy green and really deep yellows that you saw in the beginning of the early aughts. Also, while this film does have some really spectacular practical effects, the CGI that is used in this film definitely looks like something out of the year 2001. And there were just many characteristics of just how things were shot, or how things were lit, or how the cinematography ended up, or how certain visual shots looked, that just made this film feel like it came from something like 2000 to 2005. I really did like the lore and the mythology that was kind of carved out as the film went on. Definitely the first act, like I said, is trying to find its footing. And once it kind of finds those horror roots and really starts to sink them into the soil of the film, then you start to get a lot of the mystery and a lot of the lore. And I thought that those elements were done exceptionally well. I loved how those elements really kind of held the core characters captive until the final frames of the movie leading into the end credits. It was done really well, and I think that's kind of really what helped me kind of be a little bit more favorable to this movie than despite some of my issues with it. With that said, I do say that this movie is explored really well, but I really would have liked to kind of see, maybe like 10 to 15 minutes more fleshed out. Maybe some of those tonal issues wouldn't exist, or even some of the exploration of some of the character developments could have benefited from that. This movie is a brisk 80 minutes and it flies by, but I think in that and how it flies by, you really miss out on the fact that this should have been a little bit longer and should have been a little bit more fleshed out. I'm going to run this one through the Rorschach rating scale. I'm going to go ahead and give The Ghost Station a 3 out of 5. I struggled really badly whether or not to give this a 2.5 out of 3, but by the time the film actually ended and I reflected on it, I really felt really strongly with a 3. To be honest, it's probably more like a 2.75. Like I said, the mythology, the lore, the practical effects, the supernatural elements work really well in this, but it's surrounded by a cast of characters that are underdeveloped, uninteresting, and just really bland, to say the least. But if you guys have seen Ghost Station, what did you guys think about it? Comment below and let me know. Ghost Station is now available on DVD, Blu-ray, and VOD, as well as digital from Wellgo Entertainment. We'll provide a link in the show notes below, but let's talk about mental health. If you guys are new to our content, Mental Health Moment is where we'll take a theme of mental health out of the film, which we're talking about, deconstruct it for a few moments in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. There's a point in this movie where one of the characters talks about wounds needing air. And I know I talked about this a couple videos ago with kind of comparing that same similar notion to a quote from the Watchmen HBO series. There's the kind of thing, it's ironic when you have two pieces of media from vastly different sides of the world telling vastly different stories, telling basically having a character experience the same exact thing. There's an undeniable truth about it, about how the trauma that we experience from yesterday affects how the decisions that we make today. It really comes down to how we respond to that trauma. Sometimes it's in really healthy expressions, whether that is through art like poetry, painting, music, film, etc. And sometimes it finds itself in more destructive things like bottling it up, self-violence, addiction, and even suicide. And as cliche as it may sound to hear, you are not alone. Speaking as someone that has endured years of addiction, battled with self-harm, and also at the same time his own self-worth, and has even contemplated suicide, I am here today to tell you that you are indeed not alone. And the answer to that trauma is one of the hardest but most rewarding battles you'll ever endure and that you'll ever go through. You never really know how strong you are until you get the courage to overcome those years of trauma, those moments of neglect or loveless or whatever the case is. So my challenge for you from this video is to be strong and to be brave and to find healthy ways of overcoming and coping with whatever pain your past has brought you. And that's really the heartbreaking message that a lot of our characters that we follow in the Ghost Station have to go through. This is a reminder that you are not alone. So if you or someone you know is currently struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, click the links in the show notes below to check out our mental health resource library. In the show notes below, you guys will also find links to not only the subscribe button for this channel, but you guys will also find links to pick up The Ghost Station today, as well as links to our social media, podcasts on our podcast network, more movie reviews like this, our Patreon, and also ways to help support us as well in the show notes below. I gotta go catch a train, but until next time, remember to stay classy. The Ghost Station's out now.